Hello?
Yeah, what's up?
What's up? I don't know if you remember me. I asked a question the other day. It was about the Israelite view of Gentiles in the Old Testament. I kind of wanted to
I remember.
expand on that with you. It's not about the Old Testament, but it's about...
Okay.
So you said that the Israelites had to have that view or whatever because the Gentile nations were trying to destroy them because they were trying to produce the Messiah or whatever and stuff like that. But what about in the New Testament when Jesus referred to the Canaanite women as a Gentile dog and stuff, and the only way he got he healed her daughter is when she almost degraded herself and said oh, even the dogs get the scraps at the master's table. The masters in this situation would be the Jews, obviously.
Well, that's still at a period when the church is the nation of Israel. And so Jesus doesn't call all Jews, irrespective of their living, righteous. In fact, he spends most of his time rebuking the Jews and actually saying that there are Gentiles that are more righteous than the Jews. This happens multiple times in the book of Luke, which enrages the Pharisees to want to kill and to stone Jesus. But it is still the case that the pagans are also filthy pagans. So Jesus says that the Pharisees, who are self-righteous, are actually worse than the pagans and the sinners and the degenerates. But he spends his time not trying to convert Pharisees, but trying to convert people like that. So it is still the case that she is an unclean pagan person. But by her repentance and her faith and her recognition of her unclean status, morally speaking, that's when she's saved. But this is still what's called the intertestamental period. In other words, it's still the transition phase. So the end of that covenant doesn't occur until Jesus dies, descends into Hades, and then is resurrected and ascends. And then it's not even until the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, which Jesus predicts in Luke 21 and Matthew 24, that you have the complete finality of the old covenant. After that transition period from the time of Christ's birth until 70 AD, there's going to be an overlap to where, for example, Paul in one situation decides that it's advantageous to circumcise Timothy just so he won't have to deal with opposition from the Jews. And at the same time, they're still pushing at the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15 that it's no longer necessary to circumcise Gentiles. So that's what's called the transition period. But after that period, if you look at Revelations 1, 2, and 3, Jesus makes it very clear that rabbinic flesh Jews are no longer the real Jews. The church is the spiritual Israel, Galatians 6:16. It's what's given all the promises of Deuteronomy. If you look at the way that Jesus in Deuteronomy talks to the Israelites and he says that there's blessings and cursings, those same blessings and cursings are applied in Revelation 1, 2, and 3 to the 7 churches of Asia Minor. He says, if you do this, you'll be blessed, you'll overcome, you'll sit with me, judging the world, etc. If you fail, then you are subject to the curses, just like all the nations are. So in other words, it's a both and not a neither or.
Don't you think, I know this is kind of different, but it's so similar, when you guys call yourself the new Israel, the true true Jews, that kind of sounds like the black Hebrew Israelites, you know what I mean? I don't know.
Well, there's a big difference there. One of them actually fulfills the prophecies of the Old Testament of the Gentile nations coming into the church and becoming the priests, as Isaiah says, and as the entire New Testament says multiple times over, versus a racial ideology that has nothing to do with the Old Testament or the New Testament that was invented by a bunch of black cult leaders about 60 years ago.
I mean, the Old Testament is kind of a racial ethno book.
Again, you don't really, I'm not trying to be rude to you, but you have no idea about these topics because there's dozens of prophecies in the Old Testament about the Gentiles coming into the church or the covenant, which conflicts with the rabbinical interpretation. So you have an assumption that the Old Testament is what rabbinical orthodoxy says it is, and not what Orthodox Christianity says.
I know you guys have a different interpretation and stuff.
No. It's not an interpretation. It is, but it's the Christian reading of the text versus the rabbinic reading of the text. So you're basically just telling me that the rabbis are correct?
No, but I mean, you understand that like the way like the modern Jews think, and like you always see like the Orthodox, like, and just people online always talking about like the Talmud and stuff like that, like the way they think and like the way they behave.
They who?
Jews.
Okay.
Like the way they behave and think towards Gentiles and the way they act in different nations, it doesn't come from the Talmud. It comes from the Old Testament. Like you have stuff in like the Old Testament talking about how like Jews should like lend to other nations, but they shouldn't borrow from other that's usury.
No, I already said that there was a time period when those things were allowed, and then there's a time period where they're not allowed. So what you're not understanding is who's the focus of these Old Testament passages. Like all these passages about the Messiah, that's the crux of the issue. So if the Jews are right and there is no Messiah that's come, then they can still be reading their Talmud and their Torah the way they read it. And they read the Torah through the lens of the Talmud, by the way. So that's not false to say that. That's actually true. Because there's a lot of places in the Old Testament that the Jews don't want to talk about. For example, they don't want to talk about Daniel 9 and the prophecies of the Messiah in Daniel 9. And they actually curse Gentiles that read that because it's such a clear reference to the person of Christ born at the time of the Roman Empire. So I think that your assumption about how the Old Testament works is, again, coming from this rabbinic stance. But the rabbinic stance ignores all these passages about Gentiles converting to the Messiah when he comes, and wouldn't you know, that's what happens when Jesus comes. Why would there be so many passages of the Gentiles converting in the Psalms and in Isaiah and in Zechariah, even all the way back in Genesis 12, in the promise to Abraham, that all the nations of the earth would be blessed in his descendant? Why would that happen if the Christians are wrong?
Well, I think the Jews do think like the Gentiles will like come to like the real like.
I know that, but I'm saying that Jesus fulfills these prophecies, and they don't think that. So, you guys who are like sort of from this paganish perspective or whatever.
I'm not a pagan, but
you're making the pagan arguments. Like this is from the pagan perspective. Like, you guys don't even understand the biblical theology. You just cite the passages from the rabbinic argument and from the rabbinic standpoint, and then you're like, you guys aren't really faithful to the Bible because you don't have the rabbinic interpretation. Well, you're assuming the thing in question, which is whether the rabbinic interpretation is correct. So the question then is, well, who's the Messiah? I mean, the Messiah is said to die and to come back to life. And do you know that the rabbinic Jews say that there's two Messiahs? That's how they get around those passages. So what's more likely, that Jesus is the one that fulfills the passages because he died and he resurrected, or there's Messiah ben Joseph and Messiah ben David? There's two different Messiahs.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. It just feels kind of like cuck that it's like, I feel like as a Gentile, it's like you're almost like a second class. You get like the sloppy seconds. Like, I don't know. Like we were like called like filthy like pagan devil worshippers.
Well, that's like, because most of the Gentiles were filthy pagan devil
most
worshippers.
Of them were. That was actually true back then.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just like, I don't know.
So you keep saying I don't know, but like, what are all these passages about the Messiah dying in Psalm 23, Psalm 22, 23, Isaiah 54, Isaiah 53, like Isaiah 65, 66 talks about Gentile priests. What are all these passages about?
They definitely sound like Jesus for sure.
Okay. So are you saying that Jesus is a Jewish conspiracy? Is that your view?
No, I don't know if I like hold that view. It's just like, I don't know. I just don't get like why God would like choose like a people like supreme over others and stuff. Like, I don't know. I know you think like, oh, they're chosen to bring in the Messiah and stuff like that, but I don't know. Like, I don't really like that, I guess.
Okay, well then go be a pagan. Like, I mean, that's your choice. You have the see if you enjoy that world and see if that works out for you. Joshua, what's up, man? Joshua, unmute.
That's such a Father Russell kind of way of dealing with, like, when people bringing objections. He's like, oh, okay, maybe orthodoxy isn't for you.
Well, I mean, it's like, basically, the argument is, I don't like that. That's not what I want. Like, well, then this is not for you. And no, I mean, the New Testament is very clear that there is neither Jew nor Gentile. So all of these arguments are hinged on what was allowed and what God condescended to let Jews do for survival and for the protection of the production of the Messiah. And now that the Messiah has come, it's like, well, but I don't like that he did all that back then. It's like, well, okay.
Well, I mean, obviously, God, the second person of the Trinity, becomes incarnate. He obviously has to be of a particular ethnicity and stuff. So it's like, well, I don't like the region he came from. Like, how is that? I mean, the other thing I noticed about them too, they take their criticism of modern Talmudic rabbinical Judaism, just like you saw with this guy, and they read it and go, well, the ancient Hebrews must have been the same. So whatever problems people have with Talmudic Jews, they just assume what Jews are today must have been exactly the way they were back then with the ancient Hebrews.
Mm-hmm.